Strangers in the Dark, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Jackson scrambled with the oars as the sky fell into the rowboat and the ocean crashed around him. He yelled, but the roaring sea and storm swallowed his voice as he fought the waves and currents, body straining to haul the empty boat to the only splotch of land. He looked back over his shoulder to the little island, flat as a shield with a broken mountain jutting up from the center like a blade. The rain blasted it and his eyes, tainting the green with gray and white, blotting it out as a monstrous swell crashed over the whole south side of his would-be sanctuary. The island swiveled as the water turned the boat. He whirled around and fought with the oars, teeth bared and eyes burning as he panted to straighten his path and pull, pull, until his back would give out on the island shores. Movement caught his eye amidst the tossing water. Intelligent movement. He gritted his teeth, eyes stinging as tears mixed with rain, and he flicked up to his brother's sinking ship. The fishing vessel was already half down and groaning over the cries of the storm and the men Jackson fought to flee. They waved their arms from the rowboats, trying to shout over the storm for him to stop and wait, that it would be suicide to paddle out alone. His brother's limp body flopped around the floor of the boat furthest from the fishing vessel, first mate hoisting him up against his legs as he rowed, shirt clinging to his muscled back like a second skin. An air pocket burst from the ship, sprawling the three other boats apart and teetering the men until some fell into the water. Lightning flashed overhead, rapturing Jackson's gaze before the thunder exploded. He squeezed his eyes shut against the sound, straining his hold on the oars and rowed, jaw clenched and body burning as moments became an eternity and his brother's ship sank closer to the horizon. He looked back at the silhouette of the island and panted, spitting the spray of salt water and whipping back to row, ignoring the distant cries of his brother's men as they begged for him to stop. He didn't wait. Jackson grunted, wind shoving into his coats and ripping off his hat. The oil lamp beside him could tip over and burn him up in the rain at any second. The sea could reach in and steal him. The wind could stir the water into a cyclone and rouse it into a spout. He shook his head and cursed as thunder raged overhead in the black clouds, and the world fought to kill him. He panted, eyes wide and burning as he looked back over his shoulder and the silhouette that hadn't grown any closer. Cursing, he whirled back on his fellows, guts twisted. He screamed for them to hurry, motioning them on even as the water turned one of them over. He swallowed. A wave caught the boat, jolting him to the side and sending half of him into the water. He screamed uselessly, cursing the sky and the ocean as he hoisted himself back inside and righted the now dark lamp, oil still secure. He clamored for the oars, catching one before it fell in and fishing out the second before it was tossed away. He looked up at his brother's men and the world was slowed. The boats crawled on the waves, rolling as the men gripped for their lives and beat their bodies to escape the pull of the sinking ship. Jackson blinked, the thunder reverberating in his ears like a distant echo as his arms went limp beside him, barely holding the oars. The water rocked him, and he stared. He stared through the men to the dark, churning waters, to the dark, boiling sky broken with shards of lightning, like tears in the clouds. His blood roared in his ears as he blinked at the shadow swallowing them. He looked over his shoulder, and the island stood defiant in the sea, only a few minutes' row to the shoreline of black cliff and craggy rock, green with algae and stranger things, covered in flopping fish as the waves broke against it. He swallowed numbly and looked back. The ship was gone. The men were gone. All that was left was the roiling sea, fighting to kill itself, and indifferent of whether it took him with it or not. He looked up at the churning sky, and a river of lightning crawled between the dark clouds, splintering 100 times and banishing the shadow of the island. He breathed and the world went quiet, his sigh the only noise as the waters rose and arced, lifting his boat. He flung forward, hands reaching but never finding the edge of the boat as the wave tossed him to the island. The world rushed back to speed, sound crashing into his ears as he gasped and choked on cold saltwater spray. The boat flew and his eyes went wide, body flailing to grab anything as he hovered off his seat and away from the oars. He looked back as the black cliff face rushed to meet him, heart sinking and gnawing on his stomach as he half turned in the air to catch the rock. He opened his mouth to yell and struck the black wall, punching out all of his air as his head slapped the stone. Jackson opened his eyes with a gasp, choking on brine. He flung himself up, vomiting the water and wheezing before something jabbed through the flesh of his leg. He yelled, coughing and cursing as he cradled his left thigh. It throbbed above the knee, something sharp pricking him from the inside and drawing a strained groan from his lips as he squeezed his eyes shut, curling over his leg and waiting for the ache to fall to a dull throb. He panted, body hot from the pain as he opened his eyes on total darkness. He blinked, rubbing his eyes but only found two small patches of color as he straightened. They could have been a mile away or right beside him, twin hazy orbs of pale, dull light, like eyeshine. He froze and stared, pain numbed with a cold rush of fear as he fixed his eyes on the lights. He held his breath, flesh becoming stone as he listened past his own heartbeat. His hand settled on the floor of wet stone beside him with a small slide. Then something shifted. It was heavy but careful, 2 shuffles on the wet stone. And the twin lights moved. Something raked next to him. He jumped, hissing at the stab above his knee and the burn in the side of his head. Maybe I'm in hell, he thought, and this is my demon, come to torture me for everything. Every one I left behind. Metal raked on metal as sparks flew, lighting up something like a man, then again and again. "Hello?" he asked, praying it was just someone else as lost as him. "Do you know where we are?" The sparks caught and kindled a small pile of dry sticks and fiber on a stone pedestal. He blinked against the light, hand shooting before his eyes as the others set more fuel to the fire. He looked away and around, eyes scanning the dark stone walls and glittering ceiling. A pool of black water shifted a few yards away, lapping at a rocky shore with a wet trail connecting it and him. He looked back, eyes shut as he breathed and steadied himself on his hands, wincing when he moved his knee. "Thank you for the light." He met the other's face and shouted, shoving himself back and screaming, from shock and the hot knife in his knee. He stopped, panting as he squeezed his eyes shut against the pain. He scrambled back, the creature's feet padding on the stone after him as he touched the water's edge and slid. His eyes flew open on a gasp and met the creature's face as it caught him by the collar of his shirt. They stared at one another for a long moment, Jackson swallowing, frozen in its grip. After a few sharp breaths, he nodded, and it carefully pulled him onto the shore. He gasped when his leg turned, hands clawing the stone as the creature froze and watched him. Jackson breathed through the flame pulsing up his leg and found the creature, eyes washing over it as it glimmered in the firelight. It was almost a man, but its skin was black and crimson stripes. Its body was lithe muscle with a red tunic pinned at the shoulders and hips, hanging to the middle thigh. Its arms and legs were long, with webbed, opposable fingers and toes, and a fleshy fin on the forearm. Its face was bright crimson, with a round jaw, wide mouth, and high cheekbones, but there were only holes where the ears should have been, 2 vertical slits for the nose, and huge eyes. It studied him as much as he did it, tilting its bald head to look him over, clicking and chirping to itself. Its eyes were silver starbursts surrounded by red and pink with barely any white visible, shining like pale cat's eye in the light. It found its face and furrowed its hairless brow, lifting large hands like it meant no harm. It reached forward, and Jackson scooted back with a wince. It smiled, a warm, lovely thing in such a cold place. It really was almost human. He swallowed as the creature reached forward again and set hot hands on his chest, unbuttoning his shirt and feeling his damp skin. He shivered, skin bristling as it opened his clothes, bending closer to look at his ribs and stomach. It met his staring gaze and smirked, slender fingers feeling over his right leg before moving on to the left. He caught its wrist before it found the knee. It stopped and held his eye, other hand settling on his tight grip. He flicked between the creature, his knee, and back again before letting go with a nod. Its fingertips rested on its forehead as it bowed slightly. "I suppose that means thank you," he panted. The creature found his eyes with a smirk and gave a single nod before it grabbed the hem of his trousers and tore the fabric. He furrowed his brow. Wait, do you understand me?" It ripped the seam up to the calf, then found his eyes, pointing to his knee and miming a tearing gesture. He held its gaze, swallowing as he studied its face. It was a man, but it was beautiful. Not in the way a woman's beautiful, but in an otherly way, like a sea spirit or fairy. It was like looking at the most beautiful animal on God's earth and seeing the familiar glint of a soul, of reason, in its eyes. It opened its mouth and clicked something at him, snapping him back down to his knee as it repeated the action. He nodded, breathing deeply as it grabbed the fabric and tore. Jackson yelled, shoulders tense as he threw back his head. The glittering ceiling spun and blurred. He tried to look back down, but fell onto the floor instead as firelight whirled and stones doubled and tripled. He sputtered a breath as blood rushed to his head, pounding against his skull and burning in his right temple. Then the creature filled his vision, twisted in something like worry. It patted his face, fingers running to his throat, his forehead, lacing through his hair and coming away bloody. He blinked, and his eyes stayed shut in quiet and darkness. The air rung with gunfire. Jackson's eyes crept open on the blurry half-light of the creature's dying fire. The world buzzed in a blur of motion and noise. Something hissed like a crocodile beside a wet scream, then shots. Another cry, this time followed by a cut-off grunt. Jackson blinked and the creature leapt through the gloom, landing on all fours and rolling to a crouch, spinning and scurrying like a baboon. Someone else crossed the firelight. A man in human clothes, with a human voice, holding a human gun. His hair was wild and wiry, long and white and braided down the back of his torn naval coat. "Back!" The man pointed his gun at the creature. "You'll not have him! Not this one!" The creature rose on its legs, face a terrible scowl, lips peeling back over sharp teeth as it bent and vomited a shrill, piercing cry. The man covered his ears and screamed in answer, raising his gun and letting it fire, hitting the rock again and again as the creature dove and spun and leapt like a cat. It jumped, large feet catching the wall and pushing off 3 yards through the air to crouch in front of the man. It swiped its hand after him with a bestial snarl, growling like a mother lioness. The man stepped aside with a cry and brought the butt of the gun to the side of its head with a wet smack. The creature fell in front of Jackson, its eyes shut, silhouetted by a glistening crimson and ebony tide. His eyes lilted in a heavy blink as the man held the barrel of the gun to its temple. He opened them again on the creature's silver-red stare. It rolled, catching the man's wrist and tossing the gun into the fire. Its feet launched, pummeling the man's gut and casting him 10 feet to fall on his back. It rolled and stood, bolting down a wide shaft in the cave, swallowed by darkness as the man stood with a groan and loomed over Jackson. Their eyes met in the dying firelight, and something flashed. "Been a while since I had good company." The man smirked as darkness and cold flooded Jackson's senses. He groaned, face contorting as he pulled his head up from his chest. He blinked against the intense firelight and moved to rub his aching neck, but his wrists were caught together behind him. He furrowed his brow and pulled again, looking down at his now naked body, a splint of shaved branches holding his left leg straight, a rope tying his ankles together, and the man sitting on the other side of the fire. "Mornin', sunshine." Jackson hopped back, pressing into splintered wood. He looked around, and for the pool of black water, the tunnel the creature had run through, the little fire it had made, anything familiar. There was only alien walls of stone and a collection of junk, jerry-rigged contraptions, and the crate at his back.
"Stop your moving or you'll hurt yourself. I don't have much medicine, and I don't want you going rancid, boy."
Jackson pushed with his good leg, heart pounding in his head as he tried to steady his breath. Pain stuck his thigh like a hot poker, screwing up his face as he slumped into the crate and breathed through the waves of ache and goosebumps.
"Like that."
The old man waved a wrinkled, calloused hand at him.
"Don't be doing that, or you'll injure yourself more."
"Who are you?" Jackson hissed through the dull headache. "What is this place? Why am I naked?" The old man pulled off his naval coat, draping it over the remaining arm of his broken chair before rubbing his hands in front of the fire. His tattered red shirt hung off his skinny frame, full of mended holes like his breeches, with leather boots too big and worn near through the sole's edges. He smirked.
"That'd be the fish woman I found you before I did."
The creature?"
"Aye. It might look like a man, but that's the women of their kind. The men are... well, just be glad it was a woman."
He spat a laugh.
"Though maybe not. She peeled you your clothes to take your seed and soul for another brood. Hard for them to reproduce now, methinks."
"And the bonds?"
"Ah, that was I."
The man set his hands apologetically on his chest beneath the unkempt white beard.
"I don't have no want of trouble with them fish folk, and I've no way of knowing if you're one of them cultists or not."
"Cultists?"
"Aye, you hard of hearing, boy."
He waved his hands dismissively.
"Until such time as I trust you, you'll remain in them there bonds."
He lifted a carved wooden grog from a crate-turned table to his chin and stopped.
"And don't go trying to undo those knots. I've tied 'em most of me life. You won't have much luck save God reach down and set you free."
He chuckled and drank deeply until the grog was empty. "I'm not from any cult," Jackson said, struggling against the rope on his wrists. "Besides, if you thought I were your enemy, why splint my leg?" The old man eyed him and set the grog aside.
"Like I said, I don't want you stinking up the cave with infection, and I don't be having much medicine. You're welcome, by the way. That fish looked to be ready to tear your leg off when I found you."
"It wasn't hurting me." His eyes drifted into the fire, replaying his first time in the dark. "It was gentle. It seemed to be able to understand me. Wanted to help." He smiled absently, its face smirking behind his eyes.
"Well said. Defending the fish folk like a good cultist."
The old man smirked.
"She probably put her spell on you. Make you want a taste of that cold flesh?"
Jackson flicked up to the old man's eyes, frowning deeply. "I do not." But it didn't seem so black and white.
"Black and red, more like,"
the old man added before he ladled something from a bucket with his grog and drank.
"So why'd you run off? Did the prospect of being a fishwoman's sex slave not raise your mast?"
"What?" Jackson sat straight, brows furrowed as he pulled away from the crate. He sighed. "I'm not part of whatever you're talking about. I'm a sailor. I'd been out here for a few weeks for crab when a storm knocked us into some sea stacks. We had to abandon ship for an island. It wasn't even on the maps, and my rowboat capsized." The old man's fingers combed through his beard, humming as he leaned forward.
"Tell me, what's this island look like?"
"I don't know. There was a storm. It was raining so thick I could barely see the ship as it sank."
"The outline, then. The color. Anything?"
Jackson thought, and the image appeared behind his eyes. It was wide and flat, with a mountain there about the middle, and its shores are just black cliffs. It flared behind his eyes as they drifted into the darkness, the algae-covered black stone rushing to meet him, the rocks sticking out of the water with wriggling fish and gelatinous masses and creatures that had no want for a sight of the surface. Small things like fish, and bigger things like lizard dolphins, and great serpents, and creatures pulled from his brother's sea tails.
"Aye, that sounds the part. You should have caught some good crab in these waters. How much?"
The old man's voice pulled Jackson out of his head, crossing pale, wrinkly arms as he sat back in his broken chair. "How long have you been down here?" Jackson breathed an incredulous laugh. "Maybe a while ago, but these waters are dead, Barely any fish, let alone crab.
What company you work for?
I didn't. It was my father's boat, and he's dead 15 years. The old man spat and scowled.
So you became captain and left the ship to sink on her own?
My brother's captain. Was captain. I tried dragging him out. He sighed.
Good man. Ship should never be left to die alone.
The old man filled his grog again and drank it dry as Jackson glared, mouth twisting in disgust. Men like you, he thought, would see him dead sooner than see him live to buy another hunk of wood to float on. He looked aside into the darkness and breathed, remembering his brother's first mate succeeding where he'd failed, the fist striking his brother's jaw to drag him, breathing into a rowboat as Jackson boiled over and raced across the deck for his own vessel. He scowled. I should have had the spine to do it myself. To stay.
So what year is it?
Their eyes met and the old man barked a laugh, making Jackson's frown cut deeper.
Any man that sour over his brother taken by the sea can't be too in love with its people. So what year is it?
1893. Jackson eyed the other, his wrinkly face shifting between emotions under the thick beard. The old man set his mouth and nodded, pulling long white hair from the tie on the back of his head, letting it tumble down his shoulders as he leaned forward and stared into the fire.
12 years,
he whispered. Jackson furrowed his brow and stared, mirroring his words. What do you mean 12? You've lived here for that long?
Aye. Mine's a story not unlike yours. I was a cartographer in me old life. Found plenty of maps with a strange little island on 'em that was almost mythical. Most didn't have it, but the rest all had it on the same spot with similar stories. I wanted to find it, be the first to prove it to the world that it existed.
The old man found Jackson's eyes and set his mouth hard.
There was nothing here. So I went home, but it nagged at me. So I went back, you see, and in the middle of a storm, when the floor of the ocean had trembled and the island rose and waters were pulled away, it turned over me boat like yours. Killed just about everyone. The rest of us washed up in that pool. Or tried to make it on the island, I suppose.
He stood, scurrying into one of the wooden crates strewn beside his seat and the rolls of cloth arranged into a bed beneath a waxen tent. He busied inside one and pulled out 3 books before he smiled at the one he wanted and tossed it down to the stone beside Jackson's hip.
It's there. My memoir, journal, biography, what have you. I read it on my travels and after I got here.
The book was thin, not much more than a notepad, but it was bound in good leather with the letters M.S. on the front in gold filigree.
One of the last things I have that's truly me own. Everything else washes up in that pool every now and then. Fish, food, wreckage. Sometimes there's folk. Most are dead, but the living ones, well, it used to be they were better off cold.
What do you mean? Jackson tried the knots around his wrists, arms still as his fingers worked to pull the bonds loose.
The cult!
The old man threw his arms up and flung them down, hand thoughtfully brushing his beard, mumbling.
Well, the fish folk, actually. They'd come and investigate and steal away any living soul for their seed and blood.
Jackson screwed up his face.
It's true. They need new blood. They're always looking for it. Even I've got a few bastards from the dead wombs of those accursed demons.
He snapped back with a smirk and settled back onto his seat.
So as I started this here camp to better watch the pool and keep the fish away from the living. Not to mention collect the supplies. They leave those alone, and the dead. Seems they've no use for human things besides humans ourselves.
Why? What are they? Some race untouched by the deluge? A race of man unseen for generations, changed by the sea? Jackson's fingers slipped over the knots, but couldn't keep grip. His face was a mask of interest as he struggled to undo his bonds, hands aching and mouth dry for want of water. Where will you run? He thought. Will you be able to run at all? We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, he answered.
I can't say as to what they are, but they ain't no race of man I never heard of. I'll give it to 'em, though. They know how to make a city. Beasts they be, but crafty.
City? Jackson stopped trying the knots and furrowed his brow, pulling himself upright as he slid on the damp stone, chills going up his spine. On this barren rock? The storms would wash it away, more like. The old man cocked his eyebrow and leaned forward, elbows on knees as he spread his hands and barked a chuckle.
Did you forget their fish, boy?
I didn't see any gills on the one who woke me. I even saw clothes. The old man slashed his hands down.
Bah! Things of the water needn't breathe it to master it. Look at us. Man's been master of these here waters for ages. Or so we fancied.
His mouth fell slack in thought before he snapped back up, eyes rushing forward out of his own head.
Besides that, the city ain't on anything. It's here, in these caves, hewn from the very rock of the island. When it is an island.
Jackson opened his mouth to speak, and the old man cut him off.
You see, on those maps, not all of 'em had this place. And when that MS came out here, there was nothing for 'em to see. Went back, returned, and there it was. The sea quaked and shook, then the storm. Then I saw the island when the waters were pulled back by the winds. I don't think it's an island. I think the sea moves and lets it taste the air for a season before drowning it again.
That's a lot of water. And the people, where'd they come from then? Jackson's eyes wandered into the dark behind the old man's shadow. They must be some lost branch of mankind, thrown onto the shores, the caves, and forced to adapt or die.
Maybe. When I was captive in their cult, I learned the city's old. Older than Rome, or Greece, maybe even Egypt. But these ain't no immortal fish folk. No, they're just like you and me. They've been skulking in those shadows for thousands of years, keeping it up, mending it what they can where they live. But even when I was in there, afore they stole me seed to make half-breed monsters,
He spat.
there weren't many of 'em left. They spent too much time alone. Too much isolation left brother and sister to marry, father and daughter, aunt and nephew. They're mongrels. But maybe their forefathers were great ones.
His eyes lifted to the glittering ceiling of the alcove, distant with memory as he smiled absently.
It goes on for miles and miles. The oldest parts are ruined, but the center and parts of the northeast are still shining and beautiful as it had been. The white stones painted red and blue, green and yellow. The roads are paved. Flags fly from towers that stretch into the darkness and glow with a strange light too powerful to be flame, like tiny suns. Every home's furnished, every man is king and servant to none but the law, with every rule taken by vote and every dispute solved by a single appointed judge for the time.
You make it sound better than most cities. The old man blinked and furrowed his brow, twisting his face as he found Jackson and scowled.
No, it's horrible. Their idea of law is slavery and domination. Their columns are painted with murder and sacrifice and debauchery. They breed with their slaves in the streets.
The old man rose, fists balled.
It's why I left. They took me in with food and shelter and asked for my service in return. The cult wooed me, but I was wise to 'em. I learned behind their backs and found 'em out. Then they collected me, and some fish brought me to his wife.
His eyes flashed in the firelight, teeth bared as his past screamed at him, despite Jackson being deaf to it. The tension died, and he turned, mumbling as he found his seat and lowered himself down with a defeated sigh.
They made me give 'em sons and daughters, and I could never know them.
Silence crept into the cave, with only the fire to whisper against the stone. Jackson swallowed, eyes wide and fixed on the old man as he toyed with the knots again.
That's why I ran.
Jackson jumped at the old man's hoarse voice, wincing as his knees jolted inside the splint.
That's why I made camp here. Why I fight 'em when I can. If I can.
Jackson nodded. I can't say I understand what that's like. I don't even have a wife, let alone children.
Good.
The old man said curtly, making like he would stand.
Less hurt back home that way.
What about the city, though? If they're really half so bad as you say, they couldn't have built it, could they? The old man leaned an elbow on one knee and his hand on the other as he eyed Jackson, squinting and furrowing his brow before his face snapped into something comfortable.
I couldn't tell you. They're animals in clothes, is what I says. But maybe they're the degenerates who overthrew their forefathers. The mad offspring of inbred madmen and tyrants that killed each other for sport and forced themselves on whoever they could to take for wife or husband. But I don't think they're our kin. Or if they are, we're very distant cousins many times removed.
He chuckled at his own analogy.
The way they think and operate, the way they build, it's nothing like anything man's ever made. I don't care where from or when, you've not seen a thing like it nowhere.
He shrugged.
Maybe they's the children of Cain, what climbed the mountains afore the flood. Maybe they's was carried by the fallen angels and cursed by God for surviving, so that they had to love the water and despise the land, while we sons of God remained from Noah.
He found Jackson's eyes and smiled wide, something dark glinting in his eyes, in the twist of his lips, as he gripped his knees and reared back in a yawn. He rubbed his hands down his face and smacked his lips with another yawn, stretching.
Get some rest, boy. Here.
The old man reached behind him and grabbed a coat, almost like the one he'd said the creature had stolen, standing to toss it over Jackson's naked lower half.
It gets cold when you lay on that there stone. That should help.
He yawned again.
We'll finish up when I rouse.
He crawled into the crevice where his makeshift bed unfurled over moss and stuffing and feathers, closing the fabric drape like a door and leaving the fire to flicker. "Hey!" Jackson called. There was no answer. "Hey! My bonds!" Nothing. "You could at least set me free to sleep, you old devil!" Snoring was his only reply. Jackson sighed and sank against the wood behind him, sliding on the floor and hissing at the crevices that gripped and cut his tanned skin. No use in screaming for the deaf, he thought. I'll remind him when he wakes, if he even means to let me go at all. He laid his head against the crate, looking up at the glittering ceiling, each point almost like a star in an alien sky. He conjured a few constellations from them, a fish, a woman, twin babies, a tower, and sighed, looking back down at the dwindling fire. He scoffed at himself for wasting time and wriggled one of his wrists against the bonds, but the old man was right. They were sure. He bent his hand near in half and picked at the rope. He knew those knots well as the old man, maybe better given how long he'd been down there, but it wouldn't be easy to undo. He opened his eyes on the coat over his legs, fingers failing to catch the rope and pull it loose. He hissed through his nose and jolted forward, mouth coming open on a silent cry as pure fire pulsed up his leg. He bit his cheeks and breathed through each heartbeat until it was an aching throb, then opened his eyes, catching the edge of an insignia. He furrowed his brow, staring before pushing at the coat with his nose, biting it when it failed, and pulling the fabric flat over his legs. He stared and swallowed at the twin geese in the circle border, their necks arcing, their wingtips kissing at the top of the crest. He straightened, and chills ran up his spine, churning his guts as he looked away from his family crest to the makeshift bed the old man hid in. Something slid in the darkness. Jackson whipped after it, and a familiar eye-shine came from the shadow. The creature tiptoed into the firelight, red and black skin sheening like a frog, large eyes almost silver with a rim of rouge. Its tunic was stained and torn, hanging open on one side of its lithe stomach, crimson as its face. Jackson swallowed and lifted himself on his hands, baring teeth against the pain in his leg as he scooted back away from the light. He looked over his shoulder and fumbled toward the darkness as its footsteps padded on the damp stone. He whirled around and the creature stopped, hands up as it half-bowed. Firelight danced through the webbing between its long fingers, but the rest of it was cast in red and black outlines, its face obscured by shadow. It nodded its head, hands lowering as it stepped closer. He pushed back with his feet on instinct and choked a yelp. The creature leapt forward, and in a second its hand was over his mouth, faces inches from one another. They stared into each other's eyes before they looked back at the old man's bed, only breathing when the snores came swaying through the air. It crouched in front of him at an angle to the fire, hand slowly dipping away as it knelt on its knees. It grabbed the coat, holding part of it up and touching its chest. It uncovered Jackson's leg, hairless brow wrinkling at the swelling. It touched the splint, then its chest, beating its fingers into the tunic with a desperate gleam in its eyes. "You," Jackson whispered. It sighed with a smile and nodded. He swallowed and bowed his head at it. "Thank you." Their eyes met, and Jackson grinned like a boy. The firelight danced on its gleaming skin and played in the silver of its eyes. It was shaped like a man in body, but the face was ethereal. A gentle jaw and high cheeks, the lips wide and full, skull narrow. It didn't speak, but the eyes. The eyes spoke their own silent language to him. They were like candle flame in the wilderness, promising intelligence in a place that didn't make sense. Maybe it was a trap. Maybe the creature would take him to the cult and he'd become a sex slave. Maybe it would eat him. His heart skipped a beat, and his grin became a stupid smile as the creature hopped down his legs and worked on the knots at his ankle. Maybe the old man was right, Jackson thought. Maybe she did put something of a spell on me. Or maybe he was wrong. Maybe kindness was just a rarity now, and he was starved. Maybe the old man was mad, and this creature was the only of its kind, or its people were chaste, or at least wouldn't make him a slave. Or dinner. As the knot slid away from his skin, Jackson sighed and flexed his feet. The creature smiled wide, its teeth a mixture of sharp and round, though pointed more than his own. It crawled over his legs, face and chest growing hot as it straddled him on hand and foot. Their eyes met as it stepped over him and chirped low, flitting to his mouth and back to his eyes. A shadow leapt into the air, and the old man growled, falling onto the creature. It screamed, blasting Jackson back. He looked up from the floor, eyes widening as the creature stretched its jaws open like a snake, lips peeling back over 2 rows of sharp teeth as its throat opened and lunged into the air, snapping and screaming with a second set of jaws. Its eyes went black as a shark, body taut and fingers curled into claws. Jackson yelled and rolled back, heart racing and body numb with fright. It collapsed to the ground, elbow going back and punching the air from the old man's chest with a wheeze. It spun and shoved him off, the blade in his hand glinting silver and red in the firelight as he stumbled on his hands and knees. The creature grabbed its side and barked a cough, flailing to its feet after stumbling back twice, eyes glued to the old man as he rose in the shadows. It stepped back to Jackson's side, blood pouring between its webbing and spilling over when it pulled away to look at it. It hissed and winced, stumbling back as it found Jackson's eye. They held each other for a long moment, speaking without words. There was no plan. There was no help. There was nowhere else to go. It mouthed something, breathing the words. "Not. Leave." Jackson nodded and scooted back toward the creature, but they looked away too long. The old man clunked forward. "Sorry." Jackson looked up as the old man grabbed his bad leg and yanked him closer to the fire. Jackson screamed. The knife glinted in the light. Something hit his head. Jackson went still. His eyes went wide and stiff, mouth quivering as breath sputtered in and out. His body went cold, then numb, fingers and toes moving on their own. His voice came choked as he sputtered something he didn't understand. The old man hovered over his face. "Your conversation was appreciated, but it wasn't that good." The creature's screams came in waves like the old man's chuckle. Then he was gone in a black and white blur. Something crashed. The creature screamed. Flesh slid on stone. The old man heaved and grunted and yelled as he let off 5 rounds. Jackson stared at the glittering ceiling, at the self-made constellations rippling between waves of color and gray. The edges of the world went hazy. Something foul filled the air. His head lolled to one side, facing the fire as the creature spun, everything slow and streaking. It screamed, its face like a monster as it threw an iron bar at the old man. Blood dripped down its body, flinging into the air as it caught his eye for a second, spun, and darted into the darkness. The old man groaned, feet sliding on the stone as he checked the black. He turned, and his blurry image shuffled closer, crouching in front of Jackson as all the world became a whisper. He tried speaking, but his tongue just fell between his molars. He chattered. Blood welled in his mouth and trickled out as the old man sighed and patted Jackson's face.
"Sorry for all the make-believe, boy,"
the old man said with a bitter chuckle.
"I don't like lying none, but there's been nothing come up that pool in months, and me food's gone. I couldn't let the fish keep you."
He threw off the coat and groaned.
"You soiled yourself already. Well, that's me own fault for hitting your cap, I suppose. Thank you for the coat, though. It'll make a fine addition, like that fellow's, MS, whatever it stood for."
He grabbed Jackson's ankles and pulled, letting his arms bend and nearly break as his skull clunked on the stone. Jackson whined and whimpered where he meant to speak, to beg or curse, but his body couldn't obey any more. The old man stopped and let his heels clap to the floor near the fire, unfelt.
"Don't worry, boy. I'll make sure you're dead afore I start slicing. You won't feel no pain. I'm still human, after all."
He chuckled and rubbed his hands together.
"And what a meal you'll make! Plenty of muscle and just the right amount of fat."
He laughed.
"Shame you're not a woman, though."
He crouched next to Jackson's head, listening to one last sputtering noise as he grabbed the hilt of the knife sticking up from Jackson's skull.
"Sorry again. Just survival. You understand."
He jerked the knife free. Hey y'all. If you're listening to this, that means you made it to the end of the video. Congratulations. But I hope that means you enjoyed the story. If you did, make sure to like the video and drop a comment. Let me know what you think. Constructive criticism is always welcome, especially at this stage of the channel. And, most important, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, as it were, so you can stay up to date with all of my new stories. Okay, that's it. I'll see y'all next time.